All right, everyone. Thank you all for joining me today. I am your man, Corp J, and I'm excited to have you all here today. Let's talk about Niger and the situation that's currently going on in Niger right now. As you all have perhaps heard, that it was a coup that occurred on July 26th, where the democratically elected president Mohamed Bazoum was ousted out in a coup by his own generals. And ever since that has occurred, it has caused outrage all over it with neighboring countries. But more importantly, the people of Niger, Nigerians are excited about this. There's celebration going on in the streets. There's jubilation going on in the streets, which is different from what we've normally seen with coups that have occurred in this region. See, in many cases, when a coup occurs, there's a split between the citizens of that country, where one half of the country is excited and the other half is upset at the coup. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing jubilation. We're seeing citizens in Niger excited about this. So I want to talk to you about why that is the case, why they are excited. Understand that this coup is an indictment against France. It's an indictment against Western influence in a lot of the African countries. This is the fourth coup in a series of coups that have occurred in the last 3 to 4 years. Not long ago, a couple of years ago, the same thing happened in Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, Chad, all had coups. Now, what is common with all of these countries that have recently had coups in that region? These are all Francophone countries, countries that were once colonized by France, which is why I say this is an indictment against France and also an indictment against Western involvement in Africa. So we're going to talk about why we're seeing these series of coups occur within this region and why this is very, very important also, because when you look at where Niger is located, Niger borders Nigeria. Niger is north of Nigeria. And so these countries that have had coups in the last few years are neighboring countries to countries like Nigeria, Ghana. And many are asking, is Nigeria and Ghana going to be next in this line of coups that have occurred? So we're going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about these two particular leaders, Vladimir Putin of Russia, as well as Xi Jinping of China. Why these two presidents in these two countries are pivotal to what we're seeing in terms of power play and power shift dynamic in Africa. I'm also going to tell you guys about the wild card in this whole thing, which is the United States. So there's 4 countries that play in this whole thing, 3 of which are pivotal in this whole thing. So there's France on one hand, which is as a result of this recent coup, an indictment against France directly right now. There's also China, Russia, and the United States. However, make no mistake about it, and here's where what people are not talking about, is that the power play is actually between 3 countries, China, Russia, and the United States. I'm going to tell you the agenda behind this whole thing, why this thing goes deeper than what we're seeing in Niger. Why the whole thing going on right now is these 3 countries trying to exert power or trying to impose their might and the authority on Africa, and why Africa is just a pawn in this whole thing. I'm also going to tell you why this may be a setup for World War III, and which is obviously something that nobody wants. But I'll tell you why this may perhaps be a setup for that. Also, I'm going to talk to you guys about the situation with the economic communities of West African states, Ecowas, and what their response have been with this whole situation. Let's get into this whole thing because I have a lot I want to cover and I want to get right into it. So as I mentioned, there was a coup that occurred. And why is this happening? Why are we seeing coups in West African countries, especially with Francophone countries? I'll tell you why. Years ago, right after World War II and during the Cold War, when a lot of the African countries that were colonized by France were looking for independence and were asking for their independence, the condition that France gave these countries, 12 of them, was that they must sign the pact for the continuation of colonization. And in this pact, there were conditions in this pact that included things like these countries must agree that France will have military presence in this country. As a matter of fact, in Niger, France has up to 1,500 military personnel at the border of Niger. Same with the United States, by the way. So that was one of the conditions in the pact for the continuation of colonization. Another condition was that 80% of the foreign reserves in these countries must be sent and given to France, and in which France now uses those 80% reserve from these African countries, puts them in their own bank, yields interest rates off of those foreign reserves, in turn loans them as loans, business loans to countries, and also to their own communities and companies in their countries, which they use to raise capital for their own countries. In other words, it enriches France. Now, if any of these Western countries wanted to tap into their foreign reserves, they would have to do it in terms of loan, which would have penalties and also interest rate on top of those loans. The third part of it is that these countries must pay upwards of $500 billion to the French government. Now think about that for a second. Think about an African country who has just gained its independence, and they're excited and wanting to build their own countries now because they're no longer under the dictatorship of France. Now think about these countries now having to do all of these things that I've just talked about in this pact, this so-called pact for the continuation of colonization. So in other words, France wasn't willing to relinquish power or let Africa go. They were still going to have their foot on Africa. See, France is France today, and they're able to have the lifestyle they have at the expense of these African countries. The reason why French citizens can go to fancy restaurants, the reason why French citizens can eat and dine at fancy restaurants, stay in hotels, have beautiful houses, have posh roads and nice fancy clothes and fancy cars, is at the expense of African countries who are funding the lifestyle. And in return, these countries are impoverished. Men, women, and children live in abject poverty in these countries every day. And the French government and their citizens snuff their noses at these countries. It's the same thing with the West. Same thing with countries like the United States and England. Like, for example, Britain. It's the same thing with that country, who also had ties with countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and many others, who today have also close ties and strongholds in these countries. See, now I bring that up to say this, that over the years we've heard people say things like, why is Africa so corrupt? Over the years we've heard even African citizens and many outside snuff their noses at a lot of the African leaders. And I want to talk to you guys about that for a second. See, there are African leaders that are corrupt, and of those African leaders, I have no mercy, and I'm not going to make excuses for those African leaders. And then you have African leaders that were corrupted. There's a difference. So you have African leaders over the years who have tried to move their countries forward, who have tried to really build the economy of their countries. African leaders like Thomas Sankara and Maurice Yamiago, former president of Burkina Faso, Herbert Maga, former president of Benin, David Dacko, former president of Central African Republic, Sylvanus Olympio, former president of Togo, and then Modibo Keïta, former president of Mali. These presidents were all met with coup when they dared to actually challenge France and the status quo in pulling their people out of this so-called pact for the continuation of colonization. So the real problem is that why won't the West leave Africa alone to fund for itself? You see, Africa doesn't need the West. The West needs Africa. See, Africa as a continent is endowed with a lot of riches, mineral resources, a lot of things that help to power most of the countries in the West. But when you look at the countries in Africa, they're impoverished because people in the West and the countries in the West, many countries that thrive on these resources, have made it impossible for Africans in their own countries to really benefit from the mineral resources that they produce. That is what we call in our modern days fascism. That is what we call in our modern days dictatorship. That is what we call in our modern days tyrannical. And we use these words to describe many other countries. However, many somehow gloss all over the fact that these Western countries, France, like of France, uses these types of practices against their once colonized African countries. So we're seeing the people pushing back at this. In addition to all of this, the economic communities of West African states, Ecowas, which are made up of 15 countries, which are Nigeria, Liberia, Togo, Niger, Mali, Benin, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, the Gambia, and Ghana, of which Nigeria is the leader of ECOWAS. Niger has been suspended from ECOWAS, but many of the ECOWAS countries have given the military coup leaders in Niger a ultimatum and a deadline, which today is August 6th, the deadline for that, which says they need to return power back to Mohamed Bazoum, otherwise face military intervention, which in other words, face some kind of war against Niger.
No, the current approach to security has not allowed us to make the country secure, despite the heavy sacrifice made by Nigerians and the considerable and valued support of our external partners. No, the results aren't meeting Nigerians' expectations. No, we can no longer continue with the same approaches that have been proposed until now, due to the risk of seeing our country gradually and inevitably disappear. That's why we have decided to intervene and take responsibility.
Now, should Nigeria and ECOWAS be interfering with the issues in Niger? The answer will be no, because that will be going against the will of the people. If you look at what's going on in Niger right now, as I mentioned earlier on, there's jubilation on the streets because we all know that power lies with the people. So if people say that they don't want certain government, and the people say they don't want certain practices in their government, in their country, the people's mandate should always trump the government mandate. People give government power and not the other way around. So Nigeria should stay off this, and that whole threat about military retaliation is the wrong way in doing this. Nigeria's got quite a few issues that it needs to handle in its own country. So I think Nigeria should really mind its own country and solve the issues in its country, and let people of Niger solve the issues in their country. Because I will tell you this, a lot of the resources that the French citizens and the French country live off of is of the resources of these Francophone countries, one of which is uranium. So uranium currently is a chemical element which France uses to power its nuclear plant, which in turn powers the country. So 70% of the energy that France uses to power its nuclear plant comes from uranium, which Niger is the largest supplier of uranium. Now, the Nigerians and the citizens of Niger have not benefited from the expulsion or the production of uranium to France, as well as diamond, as well as many other resources that have been exploited. The countries have been exploited to power a lot of the Western countries. So these are the things that many African countries are plagued with. Many of the things that Africa suffers today, which is why a lot of the Western countries will never leave Africa, because Africa's got a lot of the resources that needs to really help the West thrive. So if you've noticed, and I don't know if you've asked yourself a question, why you've never seen any African military presence anywhere in the West, but you see a lot of Western military presence in Africa. Ask yourself that question for a second. Why is that? Why is it that Africa would not be left alone to just breed and thrive? Why is it that the West will not leave Africa to just succeed and do their own thing? Because Africa as a continent is self-sufficient. It has never needed the West. But somehow the West have always needed to infiltrate and steal and exploit these regions, and in many cases, destabilize many of the regions in Africa. You see, right before the Berlin Conference, right before the countries that went and colonized Africa, and back in the 1800s, 1884, Africa was doing well by itself. Africa was thriving. Africa never ventured out to really bother anyone. They were okay. They were self-sufficient. They were managing themselves. There was trouble in a lot of these countries. These countries were fighting each other. These countries were not thriving. These countries were losing a lot of their economic power amongst each other. And rather than fight each other, they wanted to take that fight to somewhere else. That was the beginning of the end for Africa. And they came in exploiting that region. And ever since, they've been exploiting that continent for its gains to power their own country. Because I will tell you this, that going to war is not the answer to this. As a matter of fact, the military leaders who conducted coup in Mali as well as in Burkina Faso have warned Ecowas countries that if they interfere in this matter, that they risk having a war against them. And that is interesting. That's something that we haven't seen in a lot of the coups that have occurred in the past. This is the first time that such response from these countries against the Ecowas. See, back when Ecowas intervened in a lot of the coup that occurred in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea, this is the first time we've seen a pushback from these countries against Ecowas. And so it's interesting because when you look at where these countries are positioned, as I mentioned early on, Niger and Nigeria share a border. As a matter of fact, Niger is north of Nigeria. And a lot of the other countries that have since had coups in the past are not far away from Nigeria. These are all neighboring countries. So many are asking, is Nigeria going to be the next? And is Ghana going to be the next? Because many are asking because these countries border or surrounding countries, the countries that have had coups, surround both Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, and Benin. And that is interesting because it seems to be a dominoes effect of what's going on, which is why the Burkina Faso and Mali have warned Nigeria to stay away from this. This is not your fight, and I will agree. This is not your fight. The people have spoken. The mandate of the people is that they want a different type of government. They're tired of puppet regimes. They're tired of puppet presidents who answer to the West and keep their countries impoverished. Yes, everyone can say that a coup isn't a good thing. Yes, everyone can say that a coup is not the right way to elect president or have a regime change. We all can say this until you are one of those citizens who are in those impoverished countries. As a matter of fact, let me draw your attention to history, for example. Because while we might say coups are not great and wars are not good, in many cases in history, they have been necessary. Once upon a time, even the United States, at one point, got fed up of the tyrannical treatment they were getting from Britain. The 13 colonies in the United States at one point were under the rulership of Britain. And over the years, they were also deprived of the work of their land. You see, when the slaves were in this country, and the slaves were used in the sugarcane plantation as well as the cotton plantation, and all the effort and labor that the 13 colonies were producing, many of which were really kind of siphoned off to Britain. So there was a huge part of exploitation going on over the years. The citizens in the 13 colonies, British citizens in the 13 colonies, who then became American citizens or Americans, got tired of this. They got tired of all of that. And over the years, it was the same old, same hole. They were impoverished, the same impoverished situation they were seeing in a lot of these African countries. They went through it to the point where they'd had enough. And one day they decided to take up arms against the British government and against the British Empire. That's how we got the revolutionary war that occurred in this country for 70 years, which gave this country its independence. When the people are tired, they will be tired and they'll fight back. Same thing with France. The same country right now that is currently imposing tyrannical laws and tyrannical practices against African countries. France also, at one point, had to fight the French Revolution War because of these types of behavior or these types of oppression against their own people. So the point I'm making is that while we can say that war isn't good, they are necessary because they've in turn given its people freedom. Because sometimes you're not just going to ask for freedom sitting down. Sometimes you wish that it will come with dialogue. Sometimes you hope that it will come with two people sitting together and having a good understanding. And in many times, it hasn't happened that way. People have had to fight to get their freedom. And so what you're seeing right now is people of Niger sick and tired of being impoverished, sick and tired of their own mineral resources being exploited and given to a country who has no respect for them or their citizen and really jits them off the profit or even some of the revenues from that whole resources. That is unfair. And that's why Ecowas will really need to be very careful the way they approach this. I can understand Nigeria's position on this. I can understand that Nigeria wants to show strength as the leader of Ecowas. However, the way they're going about doing it is not the way they should be doing it. Threatening military might or some kind of military intervention or some kind of military battle if they don't concede is not the way to do this, because what's going to happen is that they're going to get, just like what they've seen and gotten, Mali and Burkina Faso pushing back and saying, hey, and people of Niger are ready to go into battle. Now you're going to find, is that what we're looking for? That we have this region go to war with each other? It's not going to serve anyone any good. Not to mention that people of Niger and Nigeria share a very close tie. If you see where Niger is located, as I mentioned, it's located north of Nigeria. As a matter of fact, a lot of the money changers in Nigeria are Nigerians. A lot of the people that live in Niger are Nigerians. Nigerians also live in Niger. They have a strong, close alliance. So this is not how to foster that whole relationship. I don't think that whole tone from Nigeria or ECOWAS is the right tone to be striking against Niger, especially when the people are speaking out the way they're speaking right now. So let's talk about Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Why these two are pivotal to this. See, over the years, the relationship that the West has had with Africa has really been weakening over the years, because over the years, the relationship that Africa has had with the West has been that of master and servant, where the West and the likes of the United States and Britain dictate to African leaders and expect them to obey. It's a different relationship that China came into, which is more of like, let's sit down together and let's talk as partners. And over the years, many African countries have been fostering relationships, better relationship with China. Now, China isn't stupid. And a lot of the aid or a lot of the monies that China has been giving to African countries, even while they've been low interest, hasn't come without some stipulations tied to it. Now, China is obviously politically trying to exert some kind of a political strength here, and they have an agenda. So I also understand it's political, but the way China has approached their relationship with Africa is far different from how the West, especially the United States, England, Britain, have done in the past, which has given a lot of the African leaders and African countries a better incentive to deal with China over the years. That has really made the likes of the United States very, very uncomfortable with this, because they've seen their presence and their influence in Africa weaken, while that of China and Africa's relationship has been strengthened. Now, here's where Vladimir Putin, Russia, comes in. Russia and China are a strong alliance. They have the same system of economy. While that has been going on, there's also that war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine going on. And there's also a new partnership forming between Vladimir Putin and Russia as well as China. And this is causing a lot of concern with the United States. So if I am the US, if I am the United States, for example, Do I want a war to break out in Niger against Ecowas and against Niger? Maybe and maybe not. Because if a war breaks out, here's what's going to happen. It is going to weaken Russia's position in the war in Ukraine. Here's why I say that. Because if the war breaks out in Niger, and Niger right now obviously are moving away from France and they no longer want Western influence. They're trying to align themselves with Russia. It may cause Russia to really support that Niger and fight against ECOWAS, which I'm hoping that's not the situation. But in case that happened, this is what I'm saying. It's a scenario. That undoubtedly is going to split the forces of Russia, which weakens its region and weakens its military might against the war in Ukraine, which a country like the United States could exploit by increasing their arms and their supply to Ukraine to fight against Russia. Now, why would they want to do this? Because Russia has been a threat to the U.S. Russia has been a thorn on the side of the United States. That would be an interest if I were the U.S., and if it's a military strategy, that could be an interest for the United States to have a war break out in the ECOWAS region, because that would cause a destabilization in that region, which may weaken Russia's involvement in the war in Ukraine and cause them to lose that war. That could very well be what's at play here. Now, these are all my perception. These are all my perspective. Do with it whatever you want to do with it. But I think that the play we're seeing here goes deeper than that, because if that occurs, it also destabilizes that region, which destroys any investment that China also has had in those regions. Because if you have war breakout, it destroys resources, infrastructure. It destroys a lot of the things that have occurred in that, which then destabilizes all and destroys any investment that China has had in those regions. Now, if I'm the U.S., and I'm very concerned about the relationship between China and Africa, maybe I want that war to happen. Maybe not. I don't know. But I'm telling you that there's a lot at stake with this. And this is much deeper than what we're seeing in Niger. Which is why ECOWAS really need to be very, very careful as to how they handle this. Not only is it going to be bad for the ECOWAS country, it's not going to benefit Africa and the continent as a whole. It'll just leave it as a wasteland. So anyway, let me know what your thoughts are on this, because I'll be interested to find out what your thoughts on this. Do you agree with my session? Do you agree with what I've talked about? Do you think that the issues going on in Niger, is deeper than what I've covered in this video? Let me know. I'd like to know your thoughts. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all next time.
Och det jag lägger all min tid och jag vill ha det. Nu får mig känna safety. Jag kan nog leda baby, och jag kommer aldrig ändra mig. Aldrig kommer aldrig känna så här för någon annan än det.